Tijuana, a city built on contradictions. To tourists, it was the closest thing to sin across the U.S. border. Neon clubs that never slept, mariachis screaming in smoky cantinas, tequila pouring like water, and a promise that anything could be bought for the right price. Drugs, women, protection, even freedom. But outside the glow of Avenida Revolution, the truth seeped through like rot in the walls. Streets without light. Families living in shacks hammered together with rusted tin. Children playing in alleys where bodies were sometimes dumped before dawn. A city caught between paradise and purgatory, between the promise of America and the failure of Mexico. And into this city came a storm. By the mid-2000s, one name carved itself into Tijuana's bones: Teodoro García Simental. They called him El TEO. He wasn't born with power. He wasn't born with wealth. He was born into dust, into a Mexico where survival was the only law. For years, he walked in the shadows of giants, the Arellano Félix brothers, lords of Baja California, kings of Tijuana's corridors. Their cartel controlled the border with an iron fist. Every brick of cocaine, every pill, every bullet that crossed into the United States paid a toll to them. And for a while, El TEO was just another soldier, just another blade in their arsenal. But even then, something burned inside him. He studied the bosses. He watched how the Arellanos ruled through fear, through spectacle. And he learned that power in Tijuana wasn't inherited. It was taken. By day, he played the loyal enforcer. By night, he whispered of something bigger. The Arellanos had the throne, but their empire was rotting. Years of bloody wars, constant pressure from U.S. and Mexican authorities, and betrayals inside their own ranks had weakened them. They were still feared, but the cracks were showing. El TEO saw those cracks, and like water in stone, he widened them. He wasn't satisfied with scraps from the table. He wanted the table itself, the money, the corridors, the city. Tijuana in those years was more than just a border town. It was one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the drug world. A single crossing could move millions of dollars worth of cocaine in one night. Whoever controlled Tijuana controlled one of the busiest arteries of the U.S. drug trade. And El TEO understood something the older bosses didn't. Terror could be currency, not just fear, but a spectacle of violence so grotesque it paralyzed entire neighborhoods. Acid baths, kidnappings in daylight, executions filmed and spread like theater. He was already imagining it, already sharpening his teeth. The city was ripe for blood, and El TEO was ready to spill it. At first, he kept his ambitions quiet, a loyal servant, a shadow in the ranks. But inside, he was counting bodies, counting profits, counting opportunities. He knew the border would not remain under one flag forever. He knew the throne would be vacant sooner or later, and when that day came, he swore he wouldn't just fight for it. He would take it. Because El TEO wasn't built to obey. He wasn't built to survive on leftovers. He wasn't just another soldier. He was a wolf among wolves. And in Tijuana's alleys, where neon lights faded into bloodstains, he made his choice. He didn't want scraps. He wanted the throne. Tijuana, 2008. The city was no longer just a border town. It was a battlefield. For decades, the Arellano Félix brothers had ruled Baja California like kings. Benjamin, Ramon, Eduardo, names spoken in whispers, names that carried the weight of terror. Their organization was once the gold standard of Mexican cartels, disciplined, brutal, untouchable. They ran their empire with a mixture of blood and spectacle, turning Tijuana into a crown jewel of the drug trade. But time is the great enemy of all empires, and the Arellano dynasty began to decay. Arrests chipped away at their leadership. Assassinations left the family fractured. By the late 2000s, their power was no longer absolute. The soldiers still obeyed, but the aura of invincibility was gone, and El TEO saw the weakness. He had spent years in the shadows, learning their tactics, counting their mistakes. Where the Arellanos relied on old loyalties and family ties, TEO believed in something simpler, darker, fear as business. It started small, men disappearing, low-level rivals, debtors, even members of his own crew who hesitated when asked to kill. Acid baths became his calling card. Victims thrown into drums, flesh dissolved until nothing was left but liquid death. To the authorities, these were statistics. To the people of Tijuana, it was a new gospel. El TEO had arrived. But he wasn't content with whispers. He wanted the world to see. Bodies hung from highway overpasses, mutilated and displayed like trophies. Entire families vanished overnight. Even the police, once an untouchable class, became prey. In TEO's Tijuana, no badge could save you. And while the streets drowned in blood, the Arellano remnants clung to power, trying to remind the city who still ruled. But for every order they gave, TEO gave one louder. For every act of control, TEO answered with chaos. Then came the split. El TEO broke openly from the Arellano family. No more pretense of loyalty, no more whispers in the dark. His soldiers swore allegiance not to the dynasty, but to him. And suddenly, Tijuana was a city with two masters. Block by block, street by street, the war unfolded. One side loyal to the old guard, the other loyal to TEO's new regime of terror. Shootouts turned broad daylight into war zones. Shoppers dove to the floor of supermarkets as AK-47s roared outside. Highways became killing fields, littered with burned-out cars and bodies left for display. The city of neon and music became a graveyard with a pulse. It was more than a drug war. It was a civil war. Neighbors divided, families split, corruption spread deeper than ever before. Police officers doubled as cartel informants, sometimes even switching sides depending on who paid more that week. And through it all, TEO's name rose. The U.S. media branded him the Butcher of Tijuana. But in the barrios, some spoke his name with awe. He paid ransoms for kidnapped children if it won him loyalty. He bought silence with stacks of pesos. He cultivated terror and gratitude in equal measure, twisting the city's morality until nobody could tell savior from executioner. The Arellanos had ruled Tijuana like royalty. El TEO ruled it like a butcher. And as bullets carved through the city's streets, as mothers wept over vanished sons, as businessmen slipped envelopes of cash just to survive another week, one truth became clear. This wasn't just a war for control. It was a war for identity. Would Tijuana remain under the old dynasty? Or would it be reborn in the image of a man who worshipped only blood? TEO had made his choice. The brothers were no longer his masters. They were his enemies. Tijuana, 2008-2009. The city was no longer breathing. It was choking. Every night the streets echoed with the sound of gunfire. Every morning mothers searched morgues for the bodies of their sons. And behind it all was one man who had turned violence into his trademark. Teodoro García Simental, El TEO. Other traffickers sold drugs. El TEO sold fear. His enemies didn't just die. They vanished into barrels of acid. Their bodies melted until not even bones remained. Families received phone calls demanding ransom, and when payments didn't arrive fast enough, relatives were returned in pieces, or not at all. Kidnapping wasn't just a tool for him. It was a business model, a parallel economy built on suffering. In Tijuana, even wealthy businessmen and politicians walked the streets, knowing one wrong step meant their children could be snatched by men loyal to TEO. This was his genius and his curse. He didn't hide his cruelty. He advertised it. Bodies dangled from highway overpasses at rush hour. Severed heads were left outside police stations in blood-soaked coolers. Entire families were erased in single nights, their houses burned to ash, their names erased from memory. For TEO, murder was never private. It was theater. Each corpse carried a message. Each atrocity was a press release, and the message was always the same. Tijuana belongs to me. the city's psyche began to fracture. Shopkeepers paid protection taxes not to the Arellanos but to TEO's lieutenants. Taxi drivers whispered which neighborhoods to avoid after dark. Journalists were silenced, either bought, threatened, or buried. And in the silence, TEO's legend grew. To some, he was a demon. To others, he was opportunity. Because TEO understood something few cartel leaders ever did. Terror could enslave, but it could also employ. He handed out cash to families in need, bought groceries for entire barrios, even covered medical bills for the poor. To a community long abandoned by government, this blood-soaked man became a provider. He gave with one hand, he destroyed with the other. And that duality, fear mixed with dependence, made him untouchable. The police tried to fight him. But how do you fight a man who has already purchased half your ranks? Officers who refused his bribes ended up dead. Some were tortured, filmed, and displayed as warnings to others. Whole precincts bent the knee, reporting not to the Mexican state, but to El TEO. Even the Arellano Félix loyalists, once feared rulers of Tijuana, found themselves overwhelmed by his spectacle of violence. Their bullets killed men. TEO's cruelty killed hope. By late 2008, Tijuana was no longer a city. It was a hostage. Every headline screamed his name. Every body told his story. Every shadow belonged to him, and El TEO reveled in it. For him, violence wasn't just about eliminating rivals. It was about branding himself into history. He wasn't trying to be invisible like El Chapo. He wasn't trying to negotiate like the old bosses. He wanted the world to see, to know that in Tijuana there was no God, no law, no mercy, only Teodoro García Simental. He had turned murder into language, kidnapping into business, terror into signature. And the city signed in blood. By 2009, Tijuana was a city under siege, not by a foreign army, not by revolutionaries, but by its own sons. And at the center of the chaos stood Teodoro García Simental, El TEO. For 2 bloody years, he had branded the city with his terror. Acid baths, kidnappings, public executions. Every corner bore his fingerprints. Every street whispered his name. He had turned Tijuana into a living graveyard, and for a time it seemed nothing. Not the Arellano remnants, not the police, not even the Mexican government could break his grip. But empires of blood rarely last forever. The Mexican government could no longer ignore what Tijuana had become. International pressure was mounting, especially from the United States, which saw the violence spilling across the border. Families in San Diego lived with the fear of kidnappings. U.S. agents tracked the flow of drugs and bodies back to El TEO. Washington demanded action, and Mexico, humiliated by the chaos, finally answered. They launched an all-out hunt. Federal troops poured into Baja California. Intelligence units mapped his movements, tapped phones, interrogated his lieutenants. And yet, for months, El TEO remained a ghost. Part of his survival came from the very system designed to destroy him. He had infiltrated the police. He had bought commanders, detectives, and local politicians. Every raid seemed to arrive just minutes too late, every tip-off spoiled before it began. The government wasn't fighting one man. They were fighting a network of loyalty, fear, and corruption that stretched from the slums of Tijuana to the marble floors of Mexico City. But cracks were beginning to show. His brutality, once a source of awe, had turned into recklessness. His kidnappings targeted not just rivals, but civilians, businessmen, even political allies. The weight of his violence pushed people to desperation, and desperation breeds betrayal. The authorities received a tip. El TEO was moving south, seeking refuge outside the city he had poisoned. He was vulnerable, hiding in rented homes, shifting from safe house to safe house, his circle of trust shrinking by the day. On January 12, 2010, federal forces moved on La Paz, Baja California Sur. At dawn, they surrounded a luxury house, No gunfire, no explosions. The man who had drowned Tijuana in blood was dragged from his bed half asleep, wearing little more than the clothes he had collapsed in. The butcher of Tijuana was captured without firing a single shot. The image shocked the nation. For years, El TEO had seemed untouchable, a phantom who thrived on spectacle and fear. Now the cameras showed him cuffed, disheveled, no acid drums, no sicarios, no power. Just a man, small, sweating, broken, escorted by soldiers who barely acknowledged him. It wasn't just an arrest, it was a message. No matter how high terror climbs, it eventually falls. But even in chains, his shadow lingered. Tijuana still bore his scars. Thousands of families never recovered their dead. Businesses collapsed. Whole neighborhoods emptied out, too haunted to survive. El TEO had been removed, but the machinery he built, the economy of kidnappings, the normalization of terror remained. The cartel war didn't end with his capture. It only shifted. New names rose to claim his empire. New killers picked up where he left off. Because El TEO hadn't just killed a city. He had shown others how to do it. For the victims, his arrest came too late. For his enemies, it was a victory without peace. And for history, it was another reminder that in Mexico's narco wars, the fall of one butcher is never the end of the blood. El TEO had ruled Tijuana like a king of shadows. But in January 2010, the shadows finally betrayed him. And the butcher of Tijuana, the man who thought himself untouchable, was nothing more than another prisoner. Tijuana, after 2010, was a city trying to breathe again. The butcher was gone, but the blood in the soil remained. When El TEO was captured, there were celebrations. Politicians parading on television, the government declaring victory, newspapers printing headlines of justice finally served. For a brief moment, Mexico wanted to believe that the nightmare was over, that the bloodletting had ended with one man in handcuffs. But the truth was darker. El TEO's arrest was not an ending, it was an inheritance. The economy of terror he created didn't vanish with him. Kidnapping cells, once commanded by his voice, continued their business under new lieutenants. The acid drums were never emptied, they simply changed owners. The lie of stability, that removing a king ends the war, was exposed yet again. Because El TEO had not just ruled Tijuana, he had taught it how to feed on fear. For the people, his legacy was felt in whispers. Parents still warned their children not to trust anyone, not to walk alone, not to speak the wrong names. Businessmen still calculated the cost of doing business in blood as much as in pesos. Families carried the silence of missing relatives, their grief without closure, their prayers unanswered. The scars were permanent. Even as new bosses rose, even as rival cartels shifted the lines of control, the memory of TEO's years of fire lived in every barrio, every empty lot, where a body was once left as a message. The authorities tried to rewrite the narrative. They pointed to his capture as proof that the state could win. But the people of Tijuana knew better. They had lived under his rule, seen neighbors vanish, watched policemen kneel to his power. They understood that governments come and go, but men like El TEO leave shadows that do not fade. And across Mexico, his story became cautionary. Narco corridos sang of his violence, of his cruelty, of his hunger for power. Some cursed his name, others admired it. Because in the twisted mythology of the cartels, even monsters become legends. Today, Teodoro García Simental sits in a prison cell, stripped of weapons, stripped of soldiers, stripped of fear. He is no longer the butcher of Tijuana. He is just another inmate, rotting in silence. But outside those walls, his ghost still walks. Tijuana has not forgotten the years when a single man reduced the city to ashes. His blueprint, violence as theater, terror as business, cruelty as identity, still guides the hands of those who came after. El TEO's empire was not just drugs or money or guns. It was psychology. He broke the spirit of a city, and in doing so proved something chilling. Once a population learns to live under terror, it can never fully unlearn it. And so his true legacy is not measured in the bodies he left behind, but in the silence he left behind them. The silence of families too afraid to speak. The silence of neighborhoods that never recovered. The silence of a city forever marked by his reign. Teodoro García Simental may die in prison. His name may fade from headlines. But in Tijuana, the story of El TEO will never disappear. Because his rule wasn't just about drugs or money or power. It was about teaching an entire city that fear could be currency. And that once you've paid with blood, you never stop owing. El TEO is gone, but the terror he sold still collects its debt.